I've been really disorganized in trying to do all the things and all my scattered thoughts. And I have like 4 different essays I started writing. When I was talking about the new Dune movie, and I kind of had this one. I wrote like 3 different reviews, kind of from different angles. Some of them were kind of a little funny, a little non-serious. Then I had another one that I was writing, and it was much more serious, and it was kind of focusing on the issue of subversion and the way that all these storylines that we have are always subverted nowadays. And what do we do with that, you know? And beside that, I've been studying some stuff for the other work that I'm doing for my tectonic school project and kind of the writing that I've been doing. And I had been thinking about just some basic like guidelines for how maybe we should think about economics. And I'm not an expert or whatever on all the stuff, but just to try to see like, what are the issues that were going wrong. And I kind of started looking at in 1 Timothy, where it says the love of money is the root of all evil, or all kinds of evil, or however people want to put it. And then the Wycliffe translation, which is one of the oldest English ones, they had it differently, where they just put it as covetousness. And covetousness, to me, that seems much more closer to something that is the root of all evils, because when Paul talks about, if he hadn't known the law, he wouldn't have known what it is to covet. It's that thing that precedes all of our sinful actions, is the sinful thoughts, and it always comes from desiring something that isn't ours. So then I was looking at it more closely and trying to figure out why did he say covetousness and the others say love of money? And when you look at the Greek word, the word is actually like a combination of it's a love of silver, philia, and agarios, a love of silver. Of course, silver is silver coins, and that's silver money. And for a long time, even when they're translating up through the King James and everything, silver and gold are money. But it's not silver and gold. It's just silver. And the other aspect of that word that's translated as silver, or the root of that compound word, is shining, because that's what silver is. It's shiny. It reflects things. It reflects light. Actually, more than any other metal. It's more reflective than gold, and that's one of its unique properties. And so, I kind of just chasing this rabbit trail a little bit and thinking like, well, okay, so the love of the shining things, which, could just be, pretty things and adornment. But really, what is that shininess? That shininess is the thing that attracts our attention. And that kind of is what covetousness is. It goes back to that thing where Paul says, if I hadn't read the law that says, do not covet your neighbor's wife, I maybe wouldn't have started thinking about my neighbor's wife. But once you start thinking about it, then you open the door to that desire. And that seems like it is the rabbit hole that all the other sins can tumble out of. So then I was thinking about these other verses about money and how we use it and things. And of course, Luke always is talking about mammon, and mammon being transactional, and that seems to be his angle of what's wrong with it. And maybe that's true in a sense. Mammon is a transactional thing. And that's okay, but that's not what makes it evil. What makes it evil is when you take something that's meant for transaction, which means that it should always be changing hands. It's a way that the economy moves, and you fall in love with the thing that's supposed to be moving. You're hoarding it. So if you're hoarding silver, that's when it becomes really unhealthy. And, because if you think about that passage in Luke 16, it talks about the shrewd servant, and he's using his master's money to get things done and to really improve his own circumstance, and he's moving things around. And when it gets to the end of it, Jesus says, "If you then have not been faithful with the unrighteous wealth, the mammon, who will entrust you with the true riches?" And that word "true riches," alethenos, which is true, is that which has not only the name and resemblance, but the real nature corresponding to the name, in every respect corresponding to the idea signified by the name, real, true, genuine, opposite to what is fictitious, counterfeit, imaginary, simulated, or pretended. It contrasts realities with their semblances, opposite to what is imperfect, defective, frail, uncertain. And then again, positively, it is true, veracious, and sincere. And so it's just interesting that what he's saying is that there's a true thing, and the opposite of it is fictitious, counterfeit, imaginary, simulated, pretended. This alethenos, the truth, contrasts realities with their semblances, with something that looks like it, or that which has the name, not only the name and resemblance, but the real nature corresponding to the name. So if you think about like a woman, you can have something that is a woman and it looks like a woman and its name is woman. But you can also have something that only has the name and the resemblance. The name woman and the resemblance of a woman, but the real nature corresponding to that name is not there. That is what mammon is, in a sense. And so then I started thinking about this thing about silver more, and mammon as silver and the properties of silver and why people would fall in love with it. And it is that reflective thing. It shows a reflection of what we desire. And that then I started thinking about the story of Narcissus, who sees his reflection, falls in love with it, and dies because he's consumed by that. And of course, the love of money is also in the Old Testament in Ecclesiastes, where Solomon says, whoever loves money, silver, and it is the same thing there. Whoever loves silver never has enough. Whoever loves wealth, which is Hammon, and mammon is a contraction of me, which means from, and Hammon is mass or accumulation. Whoever loves things gotten from accumulation is never satisfied with their income. It's really very much more about this covetous, unsatisfiable thirst or desire. And so what comes of that covetous desire? It always produces things that are the reflection of what they're supposed to be. The name and the resemblance, but not the real thing. And so really what it produces is subversion, in a sense. And so what this made me think of is, in that hideous strength, the objective room. And the objective room is falsely named, because what it truly is the subversive room, because nothing in it is the thing that it's supposed to be. It's something that bears the resemblance of it, and it has the name, but it is not the thing. And so then thinking about these things in stories as well, like in making the new Dune movie, the director subverts the true story of the book, because he has the name Dune, the characters have the same names, a lot of the things are similar in appearance, the desert landscape is similar, but they all have differences, they all have changes. And so what it is it's a mammonistic reflection of the true story that Frank Herbert was trying to tell. And the interesting thing about why I would say that is because the director was going off this impulse where Frank Herbert said, the message I was trying to get across in Dune is beware of charismatic leaders. But that doesn't come through very clearly. It comes through almost as being a traditional story. There's some tragic elements in it. There is a little bit of this, I would say, characteristic of the shrewd servant. He's making the best with what he has done. But what really reflects that is that what this really reflects is that when Frank Herbert wrote that story and it came out and he thought it was a subversive story, but other people didn't read it that way, what that really reveals is the way that he looks at the world. And this has been done other ways similarly, very different category of thing, but a very similar outcome is the show that Paul had mentioned on his channel recently, and I had thought of this before, All in the Family. All in the Family was supposed to be obviously a subversive satire in the form of comedy. We were supposed to look at Archie and realize he's a bigot and he's the guy we're supposed to laugh at, and Meathead, his son, is the smart one because Meathead says all the right things. But the producers of the show had the same problem. Because what they did is they made a product that really only revealed how they actually see the world, and that they have a subverted vision of reality. Because what happened is the show comes out and people like Archie and they identify with him. And of course there's a range. If you are a more left-wing type person, you'll be more offended by Archie. You will agree with Meathead. But the problem is that to the people who genuinely embraced those feelings on the right, or whatever, the conservative values, the non-progressive values, Archie did not mischaracterize them well enough. He actually represented them truthfully. And the other example of this, more recent, is the Colbert Report, with Stephen Colbert with his weird character that he did, where that was obviously, he's a left guy, but he plays this right-wing character. And to him, he thinks it's so funny. And honestly, to me, if you were a right-wing person who thought it was based or whatever, I think that's cringe because it was clearly satire. He was clearly mocking. But there was that ambiguity where left-wing people liked it because they liked laughing at how ridiculous he was, and right-wing people liked it because they just agreed with what he was saying. So if you do that, you're failing. You're failing to subvert it. And see, here's the problem, is that subversion only works when it's a certain distance away from the truth. If it's too close to the real thing, it just fails. Nobody notices it. If it's too far away, it's too obvious. It's clearly not the same thing. So there's this point of view where you have to change something just enough to get people to notice the things about reality that you are trying to subvert. And finding that is very difficult because most of the time the people that are doing this the problem is actually in themselves. The reason why they want to subvert things is because they have an agenda, they have a motive. And of course, this is really clearly seen in the story of the objective room and That Hideous Strength. So when I'm going to end this part of the video, and then I'm going to play the selection from the audiobook of That Hideous Strength talking about the objective room. And then at the end, the thing that really stands out to Mark is the image of the cross. And as I thought about it, I realized the cross really demonstrates this perfectly because it's always using the subverted thing always points to the real thing. The real thing represents the real thing, and the subverted thing points to the real thing. So really, regardless of how you want to do it, however you're trying to get your message across, you cannot suppress the truth. And the only reason why the lie gains power is because people want to believe it. But in reality, you can't suppress the truth. So stay till the end and see that other part, because I think it illustrates it pretty clearly. So hopefully this is enjoyable and thought-provoking, and thank you for watching.
The room, at first sight, was an anticlimax. It appeared to be an empty committee room with a long table, 8 or 9 chairs, some pictures, and, oddly enough, a large stepladder in one corner. Here also there were no windows. It was lit by an electric light which produced, better than Mark had ever seen it produce before, the illusion of daylight, of a cold, grey place out of doors. This, combined with the absence of a fireplace, made it seem chilly, though the temperature was not in fact very low. A man of trained sensibility would have seen at once that the room was ill-proportioned, not grotesquely so, but sufficiently to produce dislike. It was too high and too narrow. Mark felt the effect without analysing the cause, and the effect grew on him as time passed. Sitting staring about him, he noticed the door, and thought at first that he was the victim of some optical illusion. It took him quite a long time to prove to himself that he was not. The point of the arc was not in the centre. The whole thing was lopsided. Once again, the error was not gross. The thing was near enough to the true to deceive you for a moment and to go on teasing the mind even after the deception had been unmasked. Involuntarily, one kept on shifting the head to find positions from which it would look right after all. He turned round and sat with his back to it. One mustn't let it become an obsession. Then he noticed the spots on the ceiling. They were not mere specks of dirt or discoloration. They were deliberately painted on. Little, round, black spots placed at irregular intervals on the pale mustard-coloured surface. There were not a great many of them, perhaps 30, or was it 100? He determined that he would not fall into the trap of trying to count them. They would be hard to count. They were so irregularly placed. Or weren't they? Now that his eyes were growing used to them, and one couldn't help noticing that there were 5 in that little group to the right, their arrangement seemed to hover on the verge of regularity. They suggested some kind of pattern. Their peculiar ugliness consisted in the very fact that they kept on suggesting it, and then frustrating the expectation thus aroused. Suddenly he realized that this was another trap. He fixed his eyes on the table. There were spots on the table too, white ones. Shiny white spots, not quite round, and arranged, apparently, to correspond to the spots on the ceiling. Or were they? No, of course not. Ah, now he had it. The pattern, if you could call it a pattern, on the table was an exact reversal of that on the ceiling, but with certain exceptions. He found he was glancing rapidly from one to another, trying to puzzle it out. For the 3rd time, he checked himself. He got up and began to walk about. He had a look at the pictures. Some of them belonged to a school of art with which he was already familiar. There was a portrait of a young woman who held her mouth wide open to reveal the fact that the inside of it was thickly overgrown with hair. It was very skillfully painted in the photographic manner, so that you could almost feel the hair. Indeed, you could not avoid feeling it however hard you tried. There was a giant mantis playing a fiddle while being eaten by another mantis, and a man with corkscrews instead of arms bathing in a flat, sadly coloured sea beneath a summer sunset. But most of the pictures were not of this kind. At first sight, most of them seemed rather ordinary, though Mark was a little surprised at the predominance of scriptural themes. It was only at the 2nd or 3rd glance that one discovered certain unaccountable details. Something odd about the positions of the figures' feet, or the arrangement of their fingers, or the grouping. And who was the person standing between the Christ and the Lazarus? And why were there so many beetles under the table in the Last Supper? What was the curious trick of lighting that made each picture look like something seen in delirium? When once these questions had been raised, the apparent ordinariness of the pictures became their supreme menace, like the ominous surface innocence at the beginning of certain dreams. Every fold of drapery, every piece of architecture, had a meaning one could not grasp, but which withered the mind. Compared with these, the other surrealistic pictures were mere foolery. Long ago, Mark had read somewhere of things of that extreme evil which seem innocent to the uninitiate, and had wondered what sort of things they might be. Now, he felt he knew. He turned his back on the pictures and sat down. He understood the whole business now. Frost was not trying to make him insane, at least not in the sense Mark had hitherto given to the word insanity. Frost had meant what he said. To sit in the room was the first step towards what Frost called objectivity, the process whereby all specifically human reactions were killed in a man so that he might become fit for the fastidious society of the macrobes. Higher degrees in the aestheticism of anti-nature would doubtless follow. The eating of abominable food, the dabbling in dirt and blood, the ritual performances of calculated obscenities. These were, in a sense, playing quite fair with him, offering him the very same initiation through which they themselves had passed, and which had divided them from humanity, distending and dissipating wither into a shapeless ruin, while it condensed and sharpened Frost into the hard, bright little needle that he now was. But after an hour or so, this long, high coffin of a room began to produce on Mark an effect which his instructor had probably not anticipated. There was no return of the attack which he had suffered last night in the cell, whether because he had already survived that attack, or because the imminence of death had drawn the tooth of his lifelong desire for the esoteric, or because he had, in a fashion, called very urgently for help. The built and painted perversity of this room had the effect of making him aware, as he had never been aware before, of this room's opposite. As the desert first teaches men to love water, or as absence first reveals affection, there rose up against this background of the sour and the crooked some kind of vision of the sweet and the straight. Something else, something he vaguely called the normal, apparently existed. He had never thought about it before, but there it was, solid, massive, with a shape of its own, almost like something you could touch or eat or fall in love with. It was all mixed up with Jane, and fried eggs, and soap, and sunlight, and the rooks cawing at Cure-Hardy, and the thought that, somewhere outside, daylight was going on that moment. He was not thinking in moral terms at all, or else, what is much the same thing, he was having his first deeply moral experience. He was choosing a side, the normal. All that, as he called it, was what he chose. If the scientific point of view led him away from all that, then be damned to the scientific point of view. The vehemency of his choice almost took his breath away. He had not had such a sensation before. For the moment, he hardly cared if frost and wither killed him. I do not know how long this mood would have lasted, but while it was still at its height, Frost returned.
6.5 hours later.
Meanwhile, in the objective room, something like a crisis had developed between Mark and Professor Frost. As soon as they arrived there, Mark saw that the table had been drawn back. On the floor lay a large crucifix, almost life-size, a work of art in the Spanish tradition, ghastly and realistic. "We have half an hour to pursue our exercises," said Frost, looking at his watch. Then he instructed Mark to trample on it and insult it in other ways. Now, whereas Jane had abandoned Christianity in early childhood, along with her belief in fairies and Santa Claus, Mark had never believed in it at all. At this moment, therefore, it crossed his mind for the very first time that there might conceivably be something in it. Frost, who was watching him carefully, knew perfectly well that this might be the result of the present experiment. He knew it for the very good reason that his own training by the macrobes had, at one point, suggested the same odd idea to himself. But he had no choice. Whether he wished it or not, this sort of thing was part of the initiation. "But look here," said Mark. "What is it?" said Frost. "Pray be quick. We have only a limited time at our disposal." "This," said Mark, pointing with an undefined reluctance to the horrible white figure on the cross. "This is all surely a pure superstition." "Well?" "Well, if so, what is their objective about stamping on the face? Isn't it just as subjective to spit on a thing like this as to worship it? I mean, damn it all, if it's only a bit of wood, why do anything about it? That is superficial. If you had been brought up in a non-Christian society, you would have not been asked to do this. Of course it is a superstition, but it is that particular superstition which is pressed upon our society for a great many centuries. It can be experimentally shown that it still forms a dominant system in the subconscious of many individuals whose conscious thoughts appear to be wholly liberated. An explicit action in the reverse direction is therefore a necessary step towards complete objectivity. It is not a question for a priori discussion. We find in practice that it cannot be dispensed with. Mark himself was surprised at the emotions he was undergoing. He did not regard the image with anything at all like a religious feeling. Most emphatically, it did not belong to that idea of the straight or normal or wholesome, which had for the last few days been his support against what he now knew of the innermost circle at Belbury. The horrible vigour of its realism was, indeed, in its own way as remote from that idea as anything else in the room. That was one source of his reluctance. To insult even a carved image of such agony seemed an abominable act. But it was not the only source. With the introduction of this Christian symbol, the whole situation had somehow altered. The thing was becoming incalculable. His simple antithesis of the normal and diseased had obviously failed to take something into account. Why was the crucifix there? Why were more than half the poison pictures religious? He had the sense of new parties to the conflict, potential allies and enemies which he had not suspected before. If I take a step in any direction, he thought, I may step over a precipice. A donkey-like determination to plant hoofs and stay still at all costs arose in his mind. Pray make haste, said Frost. The quiet urgency of his voice and the fact that he had so often obeyed it before almost conquered him. He was on the verge of obeying and getting the whole silly business over when the defenselessness of the figure deterred him. The feeling was a very illogical one, not because its hands were nailed and helpless, but because they were only made of wood, and therefore even more helpless. Because the thing, for all its realism, was inanimate and could not in any way hit back, he paused. The unretaliating face of a doll, one of Myrtle's dolls, which he had pulled to pieces in boyhood, had affected him in the same way, and the memory, even now, was tender to the touch. What are you waiting for, Mr. Studdock? Said Frost. Mark was well aware of the rising danger. Obviously, if he disobeyed, his last chance of getting out of Belbury alive might be gone. Even of getting out of this room. The smothering sensation once again attacked him. He was himself, he felt, as helpless as the wooden Christ. As he thought this, he found himself looking at the crucifix in a new way. Neither as a piece of wood, nor a monument of superstition, but as a bit of history. Christianity was nonsense, but one did not doubt that the man had lived, and had been executed thus by the Belbury of those days. And that, as he suddenly saw, explained why this image, though not itself an image of the straight or normal, was yet in opposition to crooked Belbury. It was a picture of what happened when the straight met the crooked, a picture of what the crooked did to the straight, what it would do to him if he remained straight. It was, in a more emphatic sense than he had yet understood, a cross.
I'm going to use a demonstration to show how the symbol of a cross, or a plus sign, which is present in a sacred symbol in non-Christian ideology, show the basic elements that are necessary, the inescapable elements, really, of the antithesis. And they demonstrate the flaw in relativist thinking, especially the extreme complete relativism, and exposes the way that weak arguments for relativism don't really stand up. So here I have 3 sticks. Now, I can have these sticks be the same length, like these two, or they can be different lengths. So either the same or different. Now, if I wanted to make a cross or a plus sign, a Greek cross has 2 equal pieces. So, let's say something like that, and assume that is a cross. Now, you could say there are imperfections in this cross. It may not be centered top to bottom, left to right, or the angle may not be correct, 90 degrees. But that's okay, because we can only judge those things according to some standards that include both similarities and differences. So, for example, if I switch out the shorter piece for a longer piece, that's a Latin cross, and it's supposed to be the same on both sides, and one side is shorter and one side is longer. So those are differences, but those differences are expressible in some form of a ratio. And even if I get it kind of like where it's not anything is the same, this isn't the same distance, this is the same distance, it's still a measurable ratio between the two. There's a comparison that allows us to differentiate, to know. So even if it's not representing it perfectly, so it's saying like, oh, we didn't do is it a cross? Yes, it's a cross. Even if it's not fitting the categories of what a proper cross should be, it's still a cross. It's a cross that's too long on this side, too long up here, or too short, etc. So go back to the one with the equal lengths to talk about. So I can try to get it as close as I can, top to bottom, left to right, centered. But if it's not, the only way that we can tell that it's not, precisely, is by measuring it and comparing either similarity or difference. Either the space here is either the same or it's different. The space here is either the same or it's different. Now these angles should be, if it was proper, if it really is a cross, they should all be 90 degrees. However, if I don't do it right, this angle is still the same as this angle, and this angle is still the same as this angle. These angles are different. These ones are the same. These ones are different. There's a ratio that can be measured. There's a comparison that can be made to differentiate between these things. Now, these pieces of wood are fairly straight, and they're the same in being fairly straight. But you could have other pieces of wood where one of them is not straight. So, for instance, this stick here is pretty noticeably curved. So let's say you do something like that and say, is that a cross? Yes, it's a cross. You can still tell it's a cross. You can tell it's a cross where one member is curved instead of straight. Now, it could be that these smaller pieces are actually not perfectly straight, but only according to some higher standard of straightness that's within a smaller tolerance than what I'm able to measure or demonstrate in this video. Now, we could even say, what if neither piece is straight? So there we got, we'll do it this way. You've got two crooked pieces of wood. Is it still a cross? Yes, it's still a cross, because you only can judge if it's not a cross because you would say, oh, this isn't straight, or this is curved when it should be straight. You're comparing what is to what should be, or you're comparing what isn't to what should be. Obviously, now, and then we could look at the angles. Okay, so obviously this is not 90 degrees. This is not 90 degrees. Likely none of these are 90 degrees. However, if this is crooked, even if there's nothing we can do to make 4 equal 90 places in 90 degrees, or even to make 2 and 2 degrees angles that are the same, when you add up all the degrees in these 4 quarters, it still is going to add up to 360 degrees. You can't keep it from doing that. It's just one of the properties of the geometry, how it works. Now, to give another example, so now we have a cross that is spray painted. The black is the cross, the white is not the cross. Now, all the same critiques can be made here. The lines aren't straight, the angles are not precise. Does that make it not a cross? No, it's still a cross. Clearly it's a cross. It's a cross that has imperfections, but an imperfection still demonstrates clear information just as well as a perfection does, as a standard of perfection. Now this has another differentiation in that being spray paint, there is a gradient. Clearly here, in the centermost part, we could say that is the cross. The part on the innermost part of the black lines, let's say that is the cross. And then out here where the overspray tapers off, we could say that clearly is not the cross. And so then we do have a fuzzy area. And this is the area where, you know, the postmodernist kind of thinking, the relativistic thinking wants to live. It wants to say, because there's this fuzzy area, you can't tell me if that's a cross or not a cross. And therefore, it could be anything. You know, we see black and white. It could be that those are dots when we get close. But maybe some of those dots are elongated. And if it's an elongated dot, it's really more of a stripe. And perhaps that what we're really looking at is an image of a zebra and not a cross at all. But, you know, to do that, there is a limit to the reasonability of that, because there is a clear area that is cross and a clear area that is not. And so what is in that fuzzy area is not an excuse to insert whatever you want, nor is it an excuse to dismiss the concept that there is a cross, that there is an absolute of some sort, and that there is difference, that there is antithesis. There's something that is and something that is not. So you have similarities and you have differences, and what's in the gradient is just room. It's room to discuss, but it is not an absolute. And the problem here is when it's treated as an absolute, to dismiss the imperfect, which actually does represent some form of standard. So here, there is no cross. The cross, the painted part of the cross, was removed. And as you can see, none of the lines are straight. None of the angles are straight. The thickness isn't the same. It's totally random. But in the absence of the thing, so essentially saying all we have is fudge, all we have is gradient, and we can look here and say this is nothing. This is randomness. It has no meaning. We can't discern it. But when we look at it closely, we can see here's the area where the cross is supposed to be, and we can say these lines aren't straight. So maybe the real cross is in the center of this. And maybe over here, you know, where it's been masked up, we can say this is, you know, some of this could be part of the real cross or might not be or whatever, but it's showing you, even you can see in the outline, there's another image of a cross. The pattern is the same because, you know, you can't have just an absence of something. And even if we go like over here, where I just have random things, you could say, like, what can we say is this? It's random. It's random. It's unknowable. But whatever's happening in this little square area, random as it seems, we can measure it. There are parts where there is paint and parts where there are not paint. You can't really escape that, even in the sensing that it's got a gradient pattern to it. You know, we can see, like, here's where there's more strong evidence of paint, and here's where there's less strong evidence of paint, or over here less and here more. The desire to equivocate things really doesn't hold up that well. And it's interesting that it's the symbol of a cross that explains this, especially in the objective room. Here's one more example, just to show how perspective can change the way we view things, but it's not an unlimited excuse to insert whatever we want and say it's true. So here we have a cross, which you can see, but if I turn the platform that it's on, now it's kind of a weird narrow shape. The angles are different. And so somebody might say, it doesn't exactly look like a cross to me. If you look at like the shadow, because there's multiple lights, it kind of looks like a pair of scissors looking thing. If I keep turning it, at a certain point, now it really looks like a stick. If I had taken the time to not just overlap the two pieces of wood and actually join them together. They're really thin, so that would have been hard. But if I had done that, you would have just seen a stick. And so you'd say, I see a stick, and whatever. That's like a Jehovah's Witnesses murder stake or something, I guess. It's really important to them that it's not a cross. But as we keep going, you'll start to see you get to a point where it's the most differentiated that it can possibly be, and then you start to return back the other way. So now it's looking more like a cross and more like a cross, and then we have a cross again, even though this is the other side, and we can do the same thing. So then we can turn it here, and now it's a stick with a bump on the other side, and then it's back to where we started, more or less. Now you could also, this is having it be in the center. There's other ways that perspective can be manipulated. So if I put it on the edge of the thing, then it affects the way we view it differently as well. Now it's a stick when it's over here, and then we can see now it's, hey, look, now it's the Greek cross. It's like the plus sign cross, and then it may even disappear from view for a while, but you can still see its shadow. So that's pretty interesting. Didn't plan this out or anything. And then you get you get back to it being clearly visible for what it is, and even in this view, you get a perspective of space, so you can see like how far away it is. So when you're there, it's far, and when you're over here, you're near. And then you could have it be really close, but then if I move my perspective, then it's close again. So all that stuff is to say there is reasons why we do not perceive things the same. However, if I point the camera at myself instead, away from the cross, then I am no longer looking at the same thing.